Our first speaker is Professor Craig Morrison, Canadian Carmelite teaching at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, Syriac and Aramaic. He graduated at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in 2002, and I would say Craig has three, or maybe even many more dimensions, but one of them is his publications in Syriac and Aramaic, and his Syriac version of 1 Samuel became a standard version. Then if you are in the biblical studies, I'm sure you heard about his commentary on 2 Samuel published in Berit Olam. But if you are interested in Lectio Coram, so Craig is a person. But I would like to reveal also one thing about Craig. If you need to get a short summary of a book, go to Craig's reviews. I don't think I have ever read better reviews. He goes to the point, and in one page you will get really what the book is about. So please join me in welcoming Craig Morrison.
Morning, Peter. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. And I also want to join with you very briefly in thanking Joseph Sievers, not just for organizing this conference. From the time Joe arrived at the Biblical Institute at the beginning of the 1990s, he has raised our awareness regarding the questions that we will be treating in these days. But there is still so much work to be done. To illustrate this, I would like to begin our conference with a page from La Domenica, a pamphlet that is widely distributed in the churches throughout Italy, with the liturgy for each Sunday. On Sunday, October 8th, 2017, we read the parable of the wicked tenants according to the Gospel of Matthew. Let me just remind you of the text. Finally, the owner of the vineyard sent his son, saying to them, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get the inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. When the chief priests and scribes and Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was speaking about them. There is a picture on the front of this pamphlet with Jesus raising his hand toward a chief priest or Pharisee. After that gospel, the La Domenica included a prayer for the Jewish people. For the Jewish people, that by recalling the miraculous interventions of the Lord, they may grow in search in truth for the fullness of redemption. Now, benign interpretations could be given for this prayer. But for a large part of the faithful, the most immediate meaning is that those wicked tenants who killed the son are the Pharisees. Then, collapsing the historical Pharisees into today's Jews, we should pray for the Jews that they recall the miracles of the Lord, an ambiguous title in academia, but for Italians in the pews who prayed this prayer. This is Jesus the Lord, and thus the Jews should search for the fullness of redemption, that is, recognize the miraculous interventions of Jesus the Lord on the 8th of October, 2017. On to my more academic question for this morning. What is in a name? Shakespeare's question, as in all things Shakespearean, succinctly expresses a concern that has been on the minds of philosophers for centuries and today linguists. What is the relationship between a name and its meaning? Juliet muses on how the name Montague, had she known it before their two pilgrim hands did touch, would have prejudiced their holy palmer's kiss. so too the name Pharisee has taken on certain prejudices before we meet them in the Gospels, and the etymologies of their name have served that prejudice. In the United States this past year, there was a controversy over what was called blackface. As a Canadian, I knew what blackface was, but I was mostly unaware of how deeply offensive this is to African Americans, those who arrived from the United States in Canada as escaped slaves, arriving in the very region of Niagara Falls where I grew up. And there you see a photo of me standing near my hometown at a monument where these escaped slaves arrived. Some of these escapees included Josiah Henson, whose life was the basis for the classic by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. For those new to this controversy, blackface was when actors would blacken their faces with shoe polish to pretend to be African Americans. This happened on TV programs that I remember seeing as a child. Now I recognize through education that blackface was a disgraceful caricature of an entire people designed to ridicule the other, capital O, other, who is not like me. This same kind of caricature sometimes happens to the Pharisees in biblical scholarship, and perhaps most often in preaching. And like my education about blackface, sometimes we are unaware of the caricature we create about this most interesting group of religious believers. We can sometimes hear in a homily, in the first century Roman Palestine, the Pharisees were, and then fill in the blank with some historical or pseudo-historical information, and so we can understand how they behave in the gospel. The argument is often circular, and a caricature of the Pharisees is taught and preached. Then, to further support this caricature, scholarly linguistic evidence is adduced regarding the etymology of the name Pharisee. This lends a scent of academia to this imaginary caricature. This morning, I would like to address the question of the meaning of the name Pharisee and present some of the meanings. Now, the area is vast, but some of the meanings that have been provided in lexicons and literature. The question Shakespeare raised in poetry was by Wittgenstein set in prose. It is inaccurate to confound the meaning of the name with the bearer of the name. So, is the etymology of the name Pharisee a heuristically useful question for discovering their origins and who they were in antiquity? Or is it just another example of the etymological fallacy in which, as Philip Durkin of the Oxford English Dictionary notes, the very word etymology, from Greek etymon, true, illustrates the fallacy? Today, the use of etymology to arrive at the meaning of a word runs counter to the modern stress on the arbitrariness of the linguistic sign. So if the title of my paper shows a lack of awareness of the current questions in modern linguistics, why then is the name Pharisee often followed by a remark about its meaning based upon its etymology? And then that etymology is inserted into the historical context in which the Pharisees lived in order to understand them and their origins. The study of names, or onomastics, is defined by the theoretical linguist John Lyons as the etymology of institutionalized names of persons and places in various languages. The modern discussion often begins with John Stuart Mill's A System of Logic. Quote, "A proper name has no meaning. A name has a denotation, referential status, but not a connotation, a lexical meaning." Words that become names retain their history as much as it can be known, but their original lexical meaning is normally lost. But it seems so easy with the name Essene, from the Aramaic Hassin or Hasaya, translating Hebrew Hasidim. Why can't we do the same with the name Pharisee? Lion treats names as a unique lexical feature of language. The relation, quoting him, the relation which holds between a proper name and its bearer is very different from the relation which holds between a common noun and its denotata. Names have two primary functions, referential and vocative. But do they have a sense? Lyons writes, what is probably the most widely accepted philosophical view nowadays is that they may have a reference but not a sense, and that they cannot be used predicatively purely as names. John Searle, with whom Lyons is in dialogue, is more decisive. A proper name predicates nothing, and consequently does not have a sense. Lyons gives the example, he is no Cicero, a predicative expression. The name itself remains without a sense, but it has a descriptive backing, a key concept I want to develop with you this morning. Quoting Lyons, the use of Cicero here has such that the name in question, although they do not have a sense, are logically connected with the characteristics of the object to which they refer. Lyons borrows the notion of the descriptive backing of a name from Searle, who writes, there are considerable problems attaching to the formalization of this notion of the descriptive backing of names. In particular, it is unclear what should count as the essential characteristics of the individual to which the name refers. One wonders then why there has been so much focus on the etymological meaning of the name Pharisee. But what remains worrisome is the descriptive backing that has been attached to this word on the basis of an etymology that, as we shall see, is at best uncertain. Searle gives the example of the title Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, but it was nonetheless the Holy Roman Empire. Perhaps in our pontifical context, we might want to debate Cyril's example, but I think we get his point. We can see an example of the descriptive backing of the name Pharisee in the title of the 2012 book by Larry Osborne, Accidental Pharisees, Avoiding Pride, Exclusivity, and so forth. While the book is addressed to Christians, the chapter titles, Pride, Exclusivity, Legalism, and so forth, illustrate well the descriptive backing of the name Pharisee today. On the first page of the book, the author mentions the ancient Pharisees, thus conflating the image of the Pharisees he presents in his book with the historical Pharisees. Getting beyond this descriptive backing is going to take a great deal of effort, beginning with our conference these days. Lyons' insights entered biblical studies through the works of James Barr, The Semantics of Biblical Language. In unraveling specious arguments for the meaning of a word, Barr refers to the dubious etymological swamp. He concludes, the neglect of the semantics of actual usage and its replacement by theoretical argument, by logistic grammar, or by etymologizing is a sure sign of linguistic irresponsibility in this type of discussion. The first place a scholar will look for the meaning of a word Pharisee is in a lexicon, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin lexicons. I want to focus my discussion on the lexicons that we normally consult today. Few of us would consult Nathan Ben Yehil's Sefer Aruk from the year 1100, though you can note that his first synonym for parush is padar, to separate, and then he links farush with the word farisha. In 1523, Sanctus Paginus published the first Hebrew-Aramaic dictionary, and there we can see that in the Kal form he knows most of the meanings of our modern dictionaries, separare, manifestare, and then manifestare, explanare. Henderson's Syriac lexicon, 1666, lists the glosses separabit, distinxit, and definivit, and then he notes the noun parisha with the simple gloss Pharisee, 1667. This is a great step forward. Unfortunately, he's not followed by later lexicographers. Polish-born Jacob Levi published his first Chaldaiische Worte book in 1867. His dictionaries were criticized by some of his contemporaries as being linguistically unsound. They questioned Levi's etymological explanations. In the 1924 edition, the lexical forms of the root parash run some 5 pages. Basic glosses for the Kal stem include absenden, trennen, and sich entfernen, to separate. In the D stems, we have erklären and deutlich machen, so to make clear, to explain. Then for the Aramaic root, he adds in the G stem, scheiden and erklären. He has an entry for the passive participle, parush, which he glosses abgesondert, separated. Importantly, Levi gives a separate gloss for Pharisee, after which he offers a comment based upon the etymology, a sect of those separated, to follow a strict observance of the Mosaic law, separated from the Zugerlosen and from the niedrigen Menschen, from the lesser people. Marcus Jastrow published his dictionary in 1886. He puts the title Pharisee under the Hebrew entry farush and offers 3 groups of glosses: seceder, discreet, and Pharisee. He adds a comment on parush, Pharisee, quote, a strict observer of the Mosaic law and rabbinic regulations. While it is unfortunate that he does not list Pharisee as a separate entry for a personal name, it is extremely helpful that his comment is not based on a supposed etymological meaning, but upon how the word is used in literature, and then he provides examples. Perhaps Jastrow recognized the etymological errors in Levi's lexicon. For many Christian readers of Aramaic, the first contact with the word parisha or parishe in the plural is the monumental work by Robert Payne Smith, the Thesaurus Syriacus, in 1898-1901. He locates the name Pharisee under the passive participle of parash, which he glosses separatus, segregatus, singularis, extraordinarius, and so forth. He continues with a separate entry for parisha, but still under the passive participle. Thus, he views the word as a name, and he separated it from the general meanings of the passive participle. But like Levi, whose dictionary he may have consulted, he offers a comment after the gloss that is in part derived from the etymology. Pharisee, following a holy life and austere ways. That would have been sufficient, but then he adds, separated from others. The English edition by Payne-Smith's daughter, Jessie Payne-Smith, Mrs. Marguliot, makes significant improvements. The name Pharisee is no longer glossed among verbal forms of the passive participle. It receives a separate entry with 2 glosses, Pharisee and noble. It is presented without reference to its etymology or its morphology. Karl Brockman, who published his first Lexicon Syriacum in 1895, gives a separate entry for Pharisaya, which he glosses as Pharisees, without an etymological meaning. This approach is then confirmed under the word Pharisha, which he suggests several glosses, the final one being Pharisee. Brockman does not appeal to an etymological meaning for the name Pharisee. The Latin dictionaries by Lewis and Short gloss Pharisaeus as the Latin of Greek Pharisaeus, and they write a Pharisee, a member of a Jewish sect of that name, no etymology. Liddell and Scott and the Oxford Latin Dictionary offer no entry, since the word is neither Latin nor Greek. BDAG gloss the word with separated ones and separatists, and cite Baumgartner's 1983 article, which I will mention below, and note that the etymology could mean specifiers, and then add the party of accurate and specific observance of the law. Though this dictionary still mentions etymologies, more than one etymology is provided, so the New Testament scholar knows that there is some discussion about the etymological derivation of this name. Turning to encyclopedic entries, the 1902 Encyclopedia Biblica, a Christian work, reads, "The meaning of the name Pharisee is perfectly clear." Compare this with Encyclopedia Judaica 1971, the meaning of the word Pharisee is uncertain. In general, Jewish scholars tend to underscore the uncertainty regarding the etymological meaning of Pharisees or ignore the question entirely, whereas Christian scholars tend to be more certain of its etymological meaning and its application to the historical Pharisees. The Dictionnaire de la Bible provides an etymological meaning. The name of Parash derives from distinguer, séparer, expliquer. Then Bost, the author of this entry, rejects the notion that it means explainers, without saying why, except noting that the scribes were the explainers and the Pharisees were the separatists. Then he goes on to explain what separatist means. But when God's work has grown, human pride and hypocrisy exploit it too often, dishonor or replace it, and those who were in the origin of pious men appear later in history as the Pharisees, putting all their efforts to be distinguished from others. Bost's interpretation is based on how he interprets the etymology of the name Pharisee. Matthew Black, the author of the entry Pharisees in the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, 1962, writes immediately after the name, an influential party among the Jews in intertestamental and New Testament times. Only after a description of the historical sources does he come to etymology, so that the etymological meaning is not at the threshold of the definition. It is not the first and perhaps only thing that a person reads. Black writes, the derivation of the name Pharisee is obscure. A common form of explanation is that the word derives from Hebrew parash, meaning one who is separate. But separate from what or whom is not clear. He suggests three possibilities: separated from priestly interpreters, separated from partisans of Jewish Maccabeus, and separated from the unclean. Black concludes, no single theory can be said to hold the field to the exclusion of others. Schnabel, who in the Revised New Interpreter's Bible Dictionary 2009 does not acknowledge the difficulty in ascertaining the meaning of the name Pharisee. Instead, he presents two common suggestions, separated ones and the explainers. This is not a step forward. In the 2016 Lexham Bible Dictionary by Johnson, an electronic Logos product, the entry for Pharisee begins with the etymological meaning. The origin of the term Pharisee comes from the Aramaic word parash to mean separate. The 2016 Real Lexicon informs its readers that the etymological meaning of Pharisee is either separated or to pronounce clearly. Thus, in the lexicons, we see a move away from etymologizing to providing a simple gloss, Pharisee, for Aramaic parisha, without comment. The entry is no longer located among the glosses for the passive participle of parash, but a separate entry is provided for this name, with a single gloss, Pharisee. Bible dictionaries, as we have seen, sometimes risk the etymological fallacy or swim about in Barr's dubious etymological swamp. But there has been a gradual shift from the certainty about the meaning of the name Pharisee to less certainty. The scholarly discussion about the meaning of the word. Heinrich Gretz, 1891, in his Geschichte der Juden, interprets the word to mean Bibelerklärer, Bible explainer. Then, in a revised English edition by the same author, he writes, the Pharisees received that name from the fact that they're explaining the scriptures in a particular manner and deriving new laws from their interpretation. He is followed by Rudolf Lazinski. Pharisee does not mean only to explain, but to explain exactly. And the explanation, not the fulfillment of the law, remains primary. Two Jewish scholars. Moving on to Christian scholars, Ramsed Balmsforth, 1905, expands on the etymology of Pharisee as separatist. They separated themselves from ordinary folk into brotherhoods. Pharisee means separatist. He is followed by Herford, 1924. The Perushim, as a class, mark the actual line of separation. That is clearly what their name means. Leo Beck was elected to the presidency of the council that created to represent the Jewish community of Germany in 1933. After Kristallnacht, Beck remained in Germany despite many invitations to emigrate. In January of 1943, he was deported to Theresienstadt, but he survived. In his 1934 book, Die Farisei, he writes in his very first line, "The word Pharisee is, since ancient times, well known and often referred to, but little understood." He notes that the etymology can mean separated or isolated, but the meaning separated is just the beginning of the problem, thus anticipating Matthew Black's article by over 30 years. Black does not cite Beck. He defines the name Pharisee as saintliness, die Heiligkeit der Exklusivität. This is the proper meaning, he writes, quote, "If the quality referred to by the Perushim is thus used to denote the quality of holiness, it falls into a definite historical context." Beck's idea is derived from Leviticus chapter 20, verse 26. "You shall be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy. I have separated you from the nations to be mine." And there you can see the Hebrew badil is translated into the Peshitta and into the Targum with the root parash, the root of Pharisee. Thus we read in Leviticus Rabbah, "The Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moses, 'Go and say to Israel, my children, as I am parush, so you should be parushim. As I am holy, so you should be holy.'" How to translate parush here in this verse? Might I suggest the translation, "The Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moses, 'Go say to Israel, my children, just as I, God, am a Pharisee, so you should be Pharisees. As I am holy, so you should be holy.'" This theme appears in the Mechilta of Rabbi Bar Yochai, "When you are separated, badilin, from among the nations, you are mine." Beck links the meaning of separation to saintliness and to community. Quoting him, "It will possibly become clear if we assume that within Palestine, the domain of saintliness, Jerusalem, was considered a narrower, more circumscribed domain of saintliness or separation, and that the community of Jerusalem was accordingly considered the holy community in the narrower sense. This is in accord with the meaning of the term the saints, as it is used in the New Testament. Beck gives the term Pharisee a new descriptive backing that has gone unheard among scholars. I don't think most Christians here would refer to our saints as remarkable Pharisees, given the current descriptive backing in our imagination. Beck's book is a must-read for anyone, preacher or scholar, who mentions the word Pharisee. Louis Finkelstein, in his The Pharisees, a Sociological Approach, 1938, argues that the name developed for certain members of the synagogue, focused on purity, who earned the name separatists. Then he notes, quote, "This name was not intended in a derogatory sense, but it merely implied separation from impurity and defilement." A Christian scholar, Wendell Riley, in 1939, in an article, Our Lord and the Pharisees, wrote, "The name Pharisee, given to them by outsiders, means separated. The Pharisees stood for the maintenance of complete separation from the Jews and the rest of the world by an intense adhesion to Jewish religion, laws, and customs. On the basis of this etymology," he writes, "their aloofness from all that was not Jewish developed into a hatred of other peoples." Notice how he collapses Pharisee with Jew and then uses the etymology to describe the Pharisees, Jews, as hating other people. Had he read Leo Beck's book? In 1939, Ellis Rivkin, in his Defining the Pharisees, Atenaetic Sources, questions the etymological approach. Quote, "The definition of Pharisees, having been secured via the word, etymology, is then freely used to determine its meaning in other texts. Is such a procedure legitimate?" After a complete study of the Tanaitic texts, he offers the following description. The Pharisees were a scholarly class dedicated to the supremacy of the twofold law, written and unwritten. Notice this definition has nothing to do with etymology. In Jacob Neusner's magisterial work, The Rabbinic Traditions About the Pharisees, before the year 70, searching through these volumes, I could not find one place where Neusner refers to the etymology. In a 1983 article titled The Name of the Pharisees, Baumgarten offers 3 etymological glosses: to state, to decide explicitly, or to specify. Later he notes that the word took on the meaning to interpret. The word parush means interpretation or commentary. He goes on to show that parash in the call means to specify in biblical and rabbinic Hebrew. He suggests that the title parushim refers to those who specify, and that this was the original meaning of the name, though he acknowledges the possible meaning separate. David Goldblatt's 1989 article, The Place of the Pharisees in First Century Judaism, no mention of the etymology of the name. So too Nickelberg's article in 1995. Lightstone in 2007 reviews the 3 most cited passages on the Pharisees in the Mishnah and the Tosefta tractate Yadayim, with no reference to etymology. So we can see the trajectory of the research. From certainty about the etymological meaning and its application, to uncertainty about its meaning, to ignoring the etymological approach, a recognition of the etymological fallacy. I would like to make a brief contribution to this conversation. The various lexical forms of parash in Syriac often appear in religious contexts, such as the word purasha in the Old Testament Peshitta. The term purshana is an offering to God. The word appears in a title in the Syriac Bible, in the Codex Ambrosianus. Here we see the word meklata purash, the distinction of foods, inserted into the biblical text between chapters 10 and 11 in the book of Leviticus. These titles come from both Jewish and Christian hands, and perhaps the proper title here should be the religious distinction of foods. The root parash is used in the New Testament with the sense to set apart for a particular mission. It appears with this sense in Luke 10:1, in the Peshitta, the Sinaiticus, in the Corinthonensis, to translate the verb anadekdumi. The Aramaic translation of Luke 10:1 lends a particular shade of meaning to the Greek anadekdumi with the translation perash, to set apart for a particular mission. In Romans 1, Paul writes that he has been set apart for the gospel, translating the Greek aphorizo with et paresh. Hewitt and Kotansky, in their Hermeneia commentary, wonder if, quote, the use of this term to describe Paul's apostolic calling may have been influenced by Paul's Pharisaic background, because the word Pharisee itself appears to come from the same root, parash, to separate, though I would add to separate for a particular mission. They note, and this quoting them, while it does not seem likely that Paul intended the wordplay on this theme, the choice of this term remains noteworthy. They are right. For a Greek reader, the wordplay is lost. But for a Christian Aramaic speaker, this wordplay resounds in their ears. Thus, another possible meaning for the name Pharisee in the context of the New Testament is a Pharisee is a person set apart, like Paul, for a particular religious mission. Biblical commentaries. The treatment of the term Pharisee in biblical commentaries can be broadly categorized under 4 headings. Commentaries that present a full discussion of the meaning Pharisee, noting the uncertainty of its meaning and suggesting possible glosses. Commentaries that offer a short remark on the etymological meaning, usually separated. Commentaries that presume the etymological meaning separated, and commentaries that make no comment on the etymology. A description of these will be in the published form. As the time is passing, I'm going to skip over this section, just wanting to mention the Jewish annotated New Testament, where, again, looking through that very carefully, not one time in any of the notes or the excursuses is the etymology of the name Pharisee given. The reader is referred to the articles at the end of the volume. And I'd like to just quote one. I'll leave the author nameless. One commentator who writes in his 1992 commentary, quote, The Pharisees were a religious party who delighted to derive their name from the meaning separated. They delighted to derive their meaning from the 1992. It is as if the author had actually spoken with the Pharisees. So to conclude, what is in a name? The answer is nothing. No sense, no denotata, as Juliet knew 4 centuries ago. The etymological arguments ignore the etymological fallacy and produce a variety of choices, separated, clarifiers, explainers, and so forth. In the dictionaries of the 20th century, scholars have gradually recognized the etymological meaning of Pharisee is at best uncertain, and that the proper gloss for the Aramaic parisha is Pharisee with no further comment. Though the name Pharisee had an original lexical meaning, that meaning today is lost. Even the interpretation separated begs the question, separated from who or from what? Scholars who create Bible dictionary entries for Pharisees should be particularly sensitive to this question, since a wide range of readers consult these resources as ready references. Brief remarks about the etymological meaning, such as separated ones, should be avoided because it can lead Christian readers to an imaginative description of Pharisaical separation. In the literature at present, there is a clear trajectory to drop the etymological argument altogether and simply consider how the term is used in particular texts and genres and by different authors. This approach coincides with the tendency in general in Aramaic lexicography. Thus, we can arrive at a description of the Pharisees in New Testament literature, Tannaitic literature, and later rabbinic literature, and so forth, and these descriptions may differ significantly from one another. Joseph Sievers has taught me that we know less about the Pharisees today than we knew 50 years ago. But the struggle to discard old ways of thinking, the current descriptive backing of the name Pharisee, is difficult. Perhaps we can imitate Juliet, who struggled to vanquish her prejudices about her beloved, named Montague. She had the right idea. Thank you.